you know, having those doubting voices in your head shouldn't be a game changer. It shouldn't say to you, oh, I've got a voice of doubt, therefore I can't do it. Women who have done the most amazing thing live with that voice of doubt. And actually, modern research about the best styles of leadership, what leadership is actually correlated with the best outcomes, is increasingly telling us that the, you know, swaggering, I've got this, I know it all, I don't need to listen to experts, you know, I'll just go and do it, that style of leadership doesn't get as good outcomes as leaders who are self-doubting, who are prepared to ask the next question, who keep their curiosity, who look to and rely on their team, that ultimately that style of leadership is correlated with better outcomes.
Hello, welcome to Cambridge Forum, coming to you live via Zoom. And this is a very first event for us. We are linking up with Australia. I'm Mary Stack, the Executive Director of Cambridge Forum. And today we're honoured to be talking to Julia Gillard, the former Prime Minister of Australia. Julia has just published a new and fascinating book entitled Women and Leadership, which she co-authored with Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala. She was the former Minister of Finance in Nigeria and also the former Managing Director of the World Bank. Well, looking at these two authors' achievements, both in government and business circles, you might be deluded into thinking that anything's possible for women in 2021. And Gillard makes the case that actually such examples are pretty rare. In reality, fewer than 10% of national leaders worldwide are women. And behind this eye-opening statistic lies a pattern of unequal access to power. In the book, Gillard draws on her own personal experiences, observations, and research in political life, which she augments with conversations with some of the world's top female leaders, including Jacinda Ardern, Hillary Rodham Clinton, Christine Lagarde, Michelle Bachelet, and Theresa May. She explores gender bias and asks, why are there just so few women in leadership roles? Before we begin today, we should note that today actually marks a mixed bag of headlines for women around the world. One, Aung San Suu Kyi, the leader of Myanmar, is currently under house arrest, charged with a variety of offences. And two, here in the United States, 3 women directors have been nominated for Oscars for the very first time. So 1 step forward, 2 steps back. So welcome, Julia. Thank you for coming all the way from tomorrow in Adelaide to speak to us.
I like that. It makes it sound like I'm from the future. I'm delighted to be with you.
And this is a great book. It's stuff full of information and personal history. It was remarkable. I learned a lot. So my first question, I guess, is like many women, I thought I knew quite a lot about how women were doing internationally. And in terms of leadership, I thought we were doing pretty well. Apparently I was wrong. Even though there's this video going around, which about 5 people sent me, of how well women are doing politically. I'm sure you've seen it on YouTube. It's a very short flick. And of course, in a short flick, the list looks impressive. But according to your book, the bigger picture isn't quite so rosy. Indeed, one could say with today's headline that we go forward and then we go backwards in terms of progress. So would you agree with that?
I think it can be confusing in some ways to look at women and women's achievements in the moment compared with the full look of statistics. And I'm glad that we get inspiration and heart from looking at what women are doing right now. But we do need to look at the flow over time and ask ourselves, are we getting better in terms of the number of women, worse, or are we just sort of puddling around the same? And when we unpack the statistics and look, for example, at political leadership, we're at a stage where around 70% of nations on earth have never been led by a woman. And whilst the number of women leaders at any one time is slowly going up, what true equality would look like in your nation, in mine, in the US, Australia, right around the world, true equality would mean that you would look at your leadership and you'd be equally likely to see a man or a woman. So in the US, you know, you would imagine equality might look like a woman getting 8 years as president, and then another woman being elected and getting 8 years as president, and then a man being elected, and so on and so forth. That would be equality. And we're clearly nowhere near there. We haven't even had the first woman yet. And this is also true when you look at the corporate sector. Yes, we're making slow improvements over time, but if you decided to flick through now any of the major listings of corporations in the world, the FTSE 500 or who's on the New York Stock Exchange or whatever, you're pretty likely to come out with a statistic near 6% for the number of women who are CEOs of major companies. The World Economic Forum tracks the rate of change, and it tells us that for political equality, we've got about 95 years before we hit it. And for economic equality, the best part of 2 centuries. So our task, I think, is to rapidly accelerate those rates of change.
So looking at the numbers, which are actually you go into in more depth in the book and break them down for people to see, I guess to play devil's advocate for a moment, if it's not the system, let's look at women. Okay, so one criticism being levied most commonly is women aren't successful at high levels of leadership, perhaps because they're not suited by nature to play the game like a man. Essentially, if you don't want to adopt the strategies of male, you know, the alpha male, or you don't want the stress or the hassle, could this be something that would affect our success rate? So I'm just going to raise a couple of points before I get you to answer that. I remember living under the reign of Thatcher for 11 years. And even though she was the longest serving prime minister in 150 years, she did not advance the cause of women. In fact, she had no women in her cabinet. She was also possibly the most detested leader in British history. But certainly she's in the rank for that. She was often accused of acting like a man in the worst sense. So you yourself had to face a bunch of hostile men in the Australian House of Representatives. And actually last year you delivered a speech about misogyny, which was voted the most unforgettable moment in Australian TV history, which is pretty amazing when you think of all the things that go on in Australia. So that in itself is worth looking at. For anyone who hasn't seen it, the link is on our website. You can watch it. It's a very good speech. So just thinking about your position for a moment, do you think you had to adapt your behaviour to survive in Australian politics?
That's a complicated question, and I do want to just briefly unpack some of the layers of it. We very clearly lay out in the book that whilst, you know, it is popularly believed that men are from Mars and women are from Venus and all the rest of it, if you talk to neuroscientists, if you went into a morgue, CSI style, and started dismembering bodies and looking at the brains of men and women, you wouldn't find any inherent differences in the grey matter. We have basically the same kind of brains, but men and women are socialised differently. And we have very gendered expectations of what they're supposed to be like. And so we do easily talk about a male and a female leadership style. We expect men to be, you know, commanding, ambitious for self, perhaps a bit ruthless, perhaps a bit arrogant, and all of that's fine. But if we see a woman acting like that, then that offends against the stereotype in our head that women should be nurturing and empathetic, and we get quite rejecting of it. I think we've got to be very careful about how we lay those stereotypes out. Otherwise, we're baking the sexism in. Or to put it another way, there's no reason why a woman who is commanding, leading from the front, telling people what to do, there's no reason to assume she's not being her authentic self. That may well be absolutely her authentic self, and she hasn't adapted in any way to the environment around her. That is just the kind of leader she is. Conversely, we might see a man who is kind, empathetic, brings the team with him, looks to the team for guidance, and he might not have adapted. He might just simply be that kind of human being. And we've got to open our eyes and just let all sorts of leadership styles bloom without putting gender around them. For me, yes, in some ways you could say I adapted, but I was being my authentic self too. I went into a structure, the Australian Parliament, that is very robust. Of course, our structures and rhythms of parliamentary days have been taken from the British Parliament, but here in Australia, we've turned it into a combat sport. We have British parliamentarians come and watch our question time and go away going, oh my Lord, what on earth was that? Because it's so rough and tumble. And so the received rules of Australian politics are that if you can't thrive in that adversarial environment of question time, you're not going to come through to be the leader. And I wanted to show, and I hope people would say I did show, that women can dominate in that sort of environment, that we can hold the House, the Australian Parliament with us and be seen to project political force in that environment. Now, that doesn't mean that it's also not right to ask the deeper question, which is, in modern democracies, are we well served by historic structures that mean we have to kind of go for the partisanship, we have to go for a bit of the political biffo? And some generations of women now are asking those questions, most notably Jacinda Ardern. But Jacinda Ardern in New Zealand is very clear that she's able to foreground these questions of changing styles of leadership. She's able to say that the core of her leadership is kindness and empathy, because in her nation, she is the third woman to lead. New Zealand is one of only 2 nations on earth to have 3 women leaders. And so she's in an environment where the question, can a woman be Prime Minister, has already been answered. That question's done and dusted. It's gone. It was answered by Jenny Shipley and then Helen Clark, who was in office for around a decade. And so Jacinda's got more space to ask these questions about what kind of parliament do we want in the modern age? What kind of politics do we want now? So I think, you know, if we look at all of this, what we can say is, let's welcome all sorts of leadership styles from men and from women, as well as having the debate about what we want leadership to be in today's world.
You raise a lot of interesting points there, some of which I was actually going to mention. The quote you mentioned from Jacinda is actually a good one in the book. She said, one of the criticisms I've faced over the years is that I'm not aggressive enough or assertive enough, or maybe somehow because I'm empathetic, I'm weak. I totally rebel against that. I refuse to believe that you cannot be both compassionate and strong. So I think that's exactly what you're saying, is that we have to change the terms of engagement. Having said that, I would not want to have to address that motley gang that shout over you in the House. I mean, it's way worse than Westminster, and I think Westminster is pretty awful. And you can't be a sort of smart, quiet intellectual. An introvert would be completely gobbled up in 5 minutes in that environment. So maybe that's a bigger question of how do you change the system? So going back to this style of leadership, okay, I wonder if, so you mentioned mentoring as being a very critical part of how somebody can feel comfortable in the role, like Jacinda, 2 women before her, you know, that she's not setting a precedent. She's not having, you know, you must have had lots of people looking for you to make a mistake constantly. Certainly that would have worried me if I was running in that position. But going back to the style of leadership and the structure of the government that you have to operate in, I was looking at the numbers in terms of the world breakdown of representation. And the Swiss Confederation, which is these cantons, 26 cantons in kind of a group government, there's a very high proportion of them that are women. Now, I don't know if that is because they've actually committed to having 50% women representation, or just that it's a more inclusive democratic structure. Therefore, it works better because women, I think by nature, their form of management is an inclusive one. I don't know if you would agree with that.
I wouldn't agree with by nature. I would agree with by socialization, and it goes right back to the earliest influences where, you know, a boy who is telling the other children what game to play in a playground is seen as a natural leader. A girl who is doing that is seen as a little Miss Bossy Boots and is probably told to dial it back a bit, like, why is she telling all of the other children what to do? And what that means, and the research shows this very clearly, is that we will accept more self-interested conduct from male leaders than we will from women leaders. Or put another way, women leaders end up on this tightrope where they've got to look strong enough to lead, because if they looked too ultra feminine, soft, people would say, oh, she's too weak to be a leader. How's she going to sustain it when the going gets tough? But if a woman comes across as solely strong, then those sexist whispers in the back of our brain will say, she's pretty unlikable, isn't she? She can't be very nice, because we see her as having given up on the traits we expect of women, particularly nurturing and empathy. And researchers have tested this. For example, at Yale in the US, researchers got two groups of voters in two different meeting areas. They got a man to address one group, a woman to address another group. They were actors pretending to be political candidates pitching for votes. They used exactly the same script, and it had in it lines like, I'm the kind of person who gets things done. I might step on someone's toes to deliver, but I always do. Coming from the man, fine, and people were polled and said they'd vote for him. Coming from the woman, there was a strongly adverse reaction. And so I think it's telling us what styles of leadership we are prepared to accept from men and from women. On the levels and structures that best facilitate women's leadership, I think, once again, this is quite complicated. I think there's some evidence that Westminster structures are actually easier for women, because the leaders are selected ultimately because they've got the confidence of the team around them. Now, of course, political parties have diversified and some involve their membership in the vote for who's going to be the leader, but you really can't come through unless the team you lead in the House of Representatives, the House of Commons, has faith in you. Whereas a structure like the US, where you go out there as an individual for president, you've got to raise an epic amount of money. Those structures, I think, can be more difficult for women. As for local levels being better for women, I think the evidence is mixed. I'm very pleased to hear the results that you're talking about. That's terrific. But there's been some evidence in the past that local structures where leaders are unpaid, that makes it a more difficult environment for women who might already be an income earner, disproportionately taking the share of family and domestic responsibilities, and they can't add an unpaid or poorly paid job on top of that. Whereas a man who can potentially rely on a woman at home to do more of the domestic labour has got more time left over at the end of the day to go and participate in that kind of local politics. So we've really got to be very specific and very thoughtful about the structures that best enable women to come through.
Now, politics aside, any really demanding top-level job requires an enormous amount of time, not to mention energy, and takes you away from other things. This was shown very much in the portrayal of Margaret Thatcher, that she had a terrible relationship with both her kids. Now, maybe she should never have been a mother, and that's another story. Maybe she didn't have the right support. I don't know. Is there something you think to the fact that I read in the book about Ngozi, is that her name, Ngozi?
My co-author, Ngozi, my co-author.
Ngozi. Okay, she had 4 children, but there were large portions of time where she had to leave the country and they had to be left. So she went and studied in the United States. She took 1 child with her, 2 were put into a boarding school. I mean, it was this mishmash of childcare. And I just wondered if, I know myself personally that I've discussed this with other women, successful women, and it's very much something you have to consider, particularly in this country, where there are very poor childcare facilities for working women. Do you think that is something that just has to be part of the package? that, you know, you have built-in creches at the place of work, and until those things happen, it's going to be virtually impossible to have a family and run a political life as well.
The experience you're talking about is actually the experience of Ellen Johnson Sirleaf, who became the first president of Liberia. And of course, she did that in incredibly difficult circumstances. She was imprisoned at various points. She was in exile at various points. And she came to be the leader of her nation after a devastating period of civil war, where women were very pivotal to the striking of the peace accords that ultimately ended the violence. So an incredibly difficult context for anybody to have been working in. And Ellen tells that story very powerfully in the book. The women we talk to in the book address these issues very frankly, including exploring whether they jeopardise their relationship with their children because of the choices that they made to become a leader. And the conclusion of each of them is very clearly that they have emerged with good relationships with their children, and that whilst they heard the voice of guilt as they went about their leadership, you know, Jacinda Ardern talks about women being high guilt creatures. Ellen Johnson Sirleaf talks very powerfully about how guilty she felt at grabbing her one opportunity for education, but that meaning that she needed to leave very young children in Liberia. Christine Lagarde, who headed the International Monetary Fund, talks powerfully about having arrangements with nannies and worrying for much of her children's life that somehow the nanny would be the principal mother figure and she wouldn't have the kind of relationship with her children that she wanted. But each of them ultimately comes to the conclusion that they got to do what they did as leaders and have family structures and have, you know, loving, strong relationships with their children. So I think there's an optimism in that. But each of them also talked about how hard it was, the struggle, the juggle. And because, you know, institutions, whether it be parliaments or big corporations, have historically been modelled around men's lives with the expectation that there's someone at home who's doing all of this childcare and domestic work, we do need to keep adapting these structures so that they are facilitative of women's lives. And some parliaments have made some changes. My own parliament here in Australia, the National Parliament, famously turned the non-members bar into a childcare centre. And of course, people have quipped ever since that the standard of behaviour has gone up as a result, children being much more responsible than drinking politicians. But, you know, still, even with those changes, there are things that need to be done here and need to be done in parliaments around the world and businesses around the world. But we should be pressing for this agenda, not just because it's better for women. It is, of course, better for women, but it's also better for men. And I think many men today look back at the lives of men historically and say to themselves, I don't want to be that kind of father. I don't want the societal expectation of me to be that I leave the house before my children have got up, that I come home after my children have gone to bed, and that I briefly get to see my children on a weekend, even as work also crowds into that weekend space. I want to be a kind of father who is there, hands-on, very present for my children. And so we need to adapt structures so that both women and men can have the opportunity for less struggle and juggle and better balanced lives.
Okay, I think everyone would agree with you on that. I'm going to tell people that they're free to type their questions into the chat box here. If anybody would like to ask a question, I don't want to monopolize things. If you have a question you'd like to tag in there, please feel free. While we're waiting for questions to come in, I was going to ask you about your own life, because you and your co-author probably couldn't have had more different backgrounds in terms of socioeconomic income. You had extremely difficult life. I think your father was in a coal miner, is that right? Or what?
He wasn't a coal miner, no. My father grew up in a coal mining village in South Wales called Cumgraach, and he left school at 14 simply because his family couldn't afford not to have him working. He was an intelligent child, he was an intelligent man. They were the days when 11-year-old children were tested to see whether they had the aptitude to go on to secondary school, and he actually finished the test the third highest in South Wales, so he clearly showed a great intellectual promise, but didn't complete secondary school. My mother, for different reasons, didn't complete secondary school either. She was very unwell as a child in the days when there was no system to help a child who'd missed lots of school catch back up. So she drifted out of secondary education. But they had long and happy lives. And ultimately, my father studied to become a psychiatric nurse, which was his profession when we migrated to Australia. And my mother worked as a cook in an aged care facility.
When you said you migrated from where?
We migrated from Wales. I was actually born in Wales. I know that there's no wonderful Welsh lilt left in my voice. But we migrated when my sister was 7 and I was 4. So my kind of lived experience has always been as an Australian.
So when you came to Australia, I mean, it's a pretty, it is a fairly competitive kind of world. I imagine it was largely dominated by men when you were growing up. Yet you didn't seem deterred in any way with having ambitions that were not connected with any role model that you saw. Is that right? Where did you get your role models from? Books?
I think my earliest role modelling would have been in my family home. My father was always interested in politics, interested in current affairs, thought that it was important that his daughters understood what was going on in the world. So he'd talk to us about those issues. He was a political person in the sense that he was a very strong Labor Party supporter, very strong trade union supporter. He worked as a unpaid delegate for his trade union. And so they were the values in our family home. And both of my parents, because they hadn't had the opportunity to go on in education as far as they would have liked, certainly inculcated in my sister and I that we should aim high, that we should aim for a university education. We were never taught that, don't worry about hitting the books, your life won't be about career. And an interesting thing that we explore in the book in a chapter that we entitle You Go Girl is that for Ngozi, for the 8 women that we interview, each of them is very clear that they were not hot-housed for leadership. They weren't told in their family home, you better end up president or prime minister, or, don't darken the doorstep again. They weren't told that. Mm-hmm. But equally, they were never told no. They were never told these things are just for the boys, or we're expecting the boys in the family to succeed academically and in careers, but we're not worried about you doing it. They were in environments that facilitated them thinking bigger about their lives. For me, I never thought about going into politics as a child. It would never have occurred to me to do that. There were no role models that would have made me think about that. What happened for me is I went to university. There was a government decision to cut back some funding to university. I got involved in a campaign to try and push that decision back. So I got politically active. We enjoyed some success. The government did back down on some cuts. I got involved in student unionism. I got more involved in Labor politics. And so over time, the idea, solidified in my mind that I could be the kind of person who ultimately went into Parliament. But I was never the kid in the playground that said, I'm going to be Prime Minister when I grow up. That was never me.
Interesting. Can we switch now back to the idea about women, who they are, who they're molded to be by society, who they are by gene makeup? Because it strikes me that even now, Theresa May, who's interviewed in the book, who actually is very interesting because I didn't know a great deal about her, and she seems to have a much bigger personality than she appeared when she was on the BBC. her personal life, she seemed to have been very confident in herself, in her own manner and her own way. And she talks about the shoe thing, which I thought was fascinating. She's known for liking fashionable shoes, and was quite, that was a big deal. When she dressed up, she liked interesting shoes. But she didn't in any way see there being a disconnect between her image as a woman and her seriousness as a politician. They didn't seem to be in any way, incongruous. And in fact, somebody in the House of Commons, a young woman, one day, she commented on this young woman's shoes, and she said, "I'm here because of your shoes," back to Theresa May. And I initially thought she meant she was filling her shoes, taking a political path. But in fact, she literally meant her shoes. She liked her shoes. And because she saw her, it gave her a kind of role model. This was a real person that she could emulate. So I think that's kind of interesting, because I think about people like Boris Johnson, who has perfected the image of the buffoon. He goes around with the crazy hair, deliberately crazied, on a bicycle. And I just try and translate a woman in that position, a crazy woman with tousled hair going around on a bicycle. And I think of the fact that she'd probably be locked up. I just can't translate those two things. Oh, here comes the Prime Minister, whereas Jacinta, she bicycles around Auckland. It's quite acceptable. So how much is the cultural thing what one expects from a woman, and how much in the image sense does one have to fulfill and deliver on that?
Yes, we examine all of this in a chapter that we call All About the Hair, and we named it that because of Hillary Clinton, who has famously joked that in her period as Secretary of State working with President Obama, she visited 112 countries, and it was still all about the hair. The press was interested in what her hair looked like when she came off the plane, and she wanted to call her book about that period in her life The Scrunchy Chronicles, the elastic band scrunchies. So, when we unpack all of this, I think, in truth, if we were all honest with each other, if we played an experiment with people and when they were nice and relaxed and said, close your eyes and, don't think of a specific person, but think of the kind of person who's Prime Minister or President, think of the kind of person who's a CEO of a business, think of the kind of person who's a military leader. What people would think of is they would think for the first view of a man in a suit, a white man in a suit, and for the last one, the military leader, they would think of a man in a uniform. That is our standard image of leadership. And complete with that standard image of leadership, around the world comes a standard uniform. We expect male leaders to be in a suit, and in other cultures and contexts, there will be an adaptation. So, for example, President Modi has his traditional Indian dress that he wears every time you see him. So their appearance is unvarying. It's not that interesting. Maybe a tie will change, the colour of a shirt will change, but not much else. For women, because we're not in this traditional mode of leadership and we dress differently, each of the women leaders that we talked about the way they had thought about and tried to manage the disproportionate interest in what they wore. That the risk each and every day was that they would be going out to talk very seriously about the economy or healthcare or national security or foreign policy or whatever, and the headlines would be about what they were wearing. And I lived through that experience myself. The first overseas trip I took as Prime Minister, I went to Afghanistan to visit our troops who were fighting there. I went to Brussels to meet with the Secretary General of NATO to talk about our strategy in fighting that war. And literally the first reports in Australia were, Julia Gillard arrives at NATO headquarters wearing a short white jacket and black pants. I wasn't going to a ball, I wasn't going to a party, I was going to a security headquarters to talk about a military strategy, and still the interest was in my appearance. And the women had different reactions to this. Some of them went out of their way to get a very standard look, their own kind of uniform, so that their appearance didn't change much from day to day. Now, the uniform might be a Hillary Clinton pantsuit, but for Ellen Johnson Sirleaf, for my co-author Ngozi, for Joyce Banda, it is traditional African dress. But they wear the same style of thing every day to try and close down people talking about their appearance. Theresa May took a different approach. She's interested in fashion. She likes fashion. It's a bit of a hobby. And so she wears fashionable clothes, including, she particularly likes shoes. And she's got that wonderful anecdote about how it interested a young woman in politics. So that's fantastic. We end up concluding out of this, look, there's no right way of handling these questions. There's no how-to manual. Women have to make their own decisions. And some women, would say, look, the last thing I want to do each and every day is puzzle through what I'm going to wear. I'd be much happier to just get a standard look. Some women will say, look, it gives me joy to follow fashion and to get the new looks and to wear the new looks. And I don't want to lose that aspect of my personality. There's no right answer. But women, as they make those choices, do need to recognise that, unfortunately, in today's world, there will still be a consequence of those decisions. If you are a woman who is very forward fashion-leaning, then part of what is said about you as a leader will always be about the fashion. And even when you're not particularly trying to cause that, there is a risk of that. I've, for example, seen stories as the new administration in the US has taken office, President Biden, Vice President Harris. There have been various pieces, not just in fashion magazines, but in newspapers like the New York Times, talking about what Vice President Harris is wearing. We haven't had a grand analysis of Joe Biden's suits. And Vice President Harris is someone who pretty much has a bit of a uniform. She, goes for the suits, predominantly trouser suits. She tends to wear the more comfortable shoes. That's been a feature of her campaigning, that she's been in the runners, doing, heaps and heaps of things each and every day. But I don't think you would say she's someone who's trying to foreground her fashion, yet people are talking about her appearance.
Okay, we got some questions for you here. How can a woman with progressive ideas and passionate enthusiasm for positive change, but no business experience, differentiate herself from the crowd? It's difficult, if not impossible, to command respect when one's resume is the successful raising of kids.
I probably would need a little bit more information to answer that question very specifically. Depends where you're, what you're trying to do, where you want to be a leader. I mean, some occupations rightly require economic experience before people are going to be given an opportunity. My co-author, for example, Ngozi, spent 20 years at the World Bank, rising to the second highest position in the World Bank. She was able to do that because she's an economist and she's a mother and an economist. If in other contexts where those skills aren't being required, but somehow they're being viewed as a badge of intelligence, whereas doing other things that women are more likely to do are being dismissed as not giving them the relevant skills, then we've obviously got to contest those weightings. We do know that across the workforce, there is an undervaluing of women's skills. In Australia, when I was Prime Minister, we had a historic equal pay case for women who work in the social and community services sector. So women who are social workers and other like occupations. These are people with university degrees, and yet when we compared their earnings with other areas of the labour market where people had university degrees, they were on average getting paid 30 or 40% less. So it's telling you that we tend to undervalue caring skills. We just go, oh, they're somehow innate in women, so they don't really have to be paid for. I think we've got to upend that analysis.
We've got some more really good questions here. Often as women, we do not see ourselves as worthy. It goes beyond the imposter syndrome It is as though we have an unworthiness gene. Who am I to do this? Can you speak to this?
I hope that one of the things that gives people heart in the book is that the women leaders we spoke to all owned up very frankly to having
We
doubts.
do. Yeah.
I think one of the things with role modeling, we talk about the importance of role modeling. You can't see it, you can't be it if you can't see it. But I do think sometimes we underestimate the gap that women young women look at women who are at the pinnacle of their achievement. For example, they might be looking at Kamala Harris now, and they might be saying to themselves, oh my God, I could never be like her. I could never do what she's done. And what they're missing is two things. Women leaders' heads are often full of doubts as well. And second, she didn't, fall out of the sky into the chair as vice president. She had a long career of getting more and more skilled and more good at what she did and more visible, which ultimately meant that she came through into contention to be vice president, then was selected and elected. So, having those doubting voices in your head shouldn't be a game changer. It shouldn't say to you, oh, I've got a voice of doubt, therefore I can't do it. Women who have done the most amazing thing live with that voice of doubt. And actually, modern research about the best styles of leadership, what leadership is actually correlated with the best outcomes, is increasingly telling us that the swaggering, I've got this, I know it all, I don't need to listen to experts, I'll just go and do it, that style of leadership doesn't get as good outcomes as leaders who are self-doubting, who are prepared to ask the next question, who keep their curiosity, who look to and rely on their team, that ultimately that style of leadership is correlated with better outcomes. And if you wanted to snapshot the leadership story of the pandemic, I think you can snapshot it like that. The blustering male, ultra macho, swaggering style of this virus, I'm going to get it licked. That style of leadership hasn't won through. What has won through is the more cautious, careful, listen to the expert style of leadership. So don't necessarily view your doubts as a negative. They could be helping you to be a better leader.
Also, I can't resist saying this because you've quoted such great examples of women really usually going above and beyond because they have to be better than their male equivalent. It's not enough to be equal to, you usually have to be better than. And of course, the glaring anomaly is Mr. Trump, who went into politics with zip experience based on being a game show host. So bluster carries you a good deal in this culture, or certainly did, but luckily that has ceased to be the case. Okay, 3 more questions. I think this is quite fun. Who are the most powerful women leaders today? Where do you rank Lady Gaga, Hillary Clinton, Melinda Gates, the new poet laureate? Is there really any trait that they have in common? It's a good question.
Yeah, I mean, when we talk about power, we obviously think often about political power, about structural power, about being in the office of president or prime minister. In the book, we interviewed political leaders. We didn't do that because the book is all about politics. We did it because we thought the spotlight on the gendered experience is whitest and hottest in politics, but we could learn from that for other walks of life. But I think we all know power is much more diffuse in our societies than just the people who are at the apex of various structures, parliaments, businesses. Lady Gaga has, power through social media influence, through cultural influence, and that is important in our societies. And so I think in some ways that is challenging us to broaden the category of who is a leader from the very stereotypical, you are a leader if the position that you hold is a formal one which carries authority and leadership. You can be a leader in many different ways. As to would those women have something in common, I suspect what they've got in common is a sense of passion and purpose they've been driven to achieve in the fields that they've chosen. I think they've probably got in common a sense of self-doubt as they go about that they're not blusterers, that they're people who have focused, worked hard, honed their craft, and always, taken that very, very seriously. And I would hope too that each of them has a view about how they can use their power to role model and to change circumstances for women.
Okay, somebody has written, Sarah Mills has written a good question. How do you think a strong qualified woman on a board can best influence the men who only think she is way out of her league and who dismiss every suggestion she makes? Ooh, that's
that's a really tough one, and it's very tough for women when they're the one woman in the room. We quote research in the book. I love this piece of research. I think it's so telling that if you have a group of 5 people who are trying to make a decision, it is only when 4 out of the 5 are women that women will get a fair share of the talking time. Or to put it the other way, if there's more than one man, the men will dominate the talking time. They'll take more than their fair share of the talking time. What changes that dynamic is if the decision-making structure of the group is expressly consensus, not majority rules or loudest voice. So if you tell a group of 5 people, you have to come up with a consensus decision, then people will adapt their behaviours so that everybody in the group gets to have a say. Otherwise, they can't work out if there's consensus. So I think pointing to pieces of research like that and urging structures, whether they be corporate boards or anything else, to adopt a more consensual style might be one place to start. There's also good research to show that diverse teams make better decisions, that teams that are full of similar people, all men from similar backgrounds, will not make the same quality of decisions as if there's a diversity of voices. And that's true in the corporate world, and research does show that. But I'd also be trying to find a way to add to the number of women on the board. We unpack in the book expectations around corporations, and it was true when the campaigns first started to get women on corporate boards that corporations could say to themselves, oh, that gender equality thing, we fixed it, we've got one woman on the board. But now consumer expectations and investors' expectations are changing to be much more pressing on having a gender equal and diverse board. So I'd be trying to channel some of that energy to get more women on the board.
Good points there. Okay, quick one here. Can you point to a teen accessible book or film to help uncover and dispel tacit bias against female leadership? Norma Ray?
Yes, Norma Ray would be one.
9 to 5. They actually just did a great review of the 9 to 5 movie and the organization on PBS 2 nights ago. It was really interesting. Yeah, about how the movement actually affected change.
I'd have to say teen movies and teen literature is not one of my areas of expertise. So there would be many people better qualified to answer this question than me. But I'm sure it's out there. I certainly know I've got a 5-year-old great niece, and I've certainly seen in the children's books that are available to her that there's a very conscious effort to change the role modelling and to make a difference. So I would hope that's true for teens too. I'm sure that it is.
If anybody knows, they can send it to me and I can post it on the website or send it out to everybody. Another question. What impact do you hope your book your compilation of the wisdom of a myriad of powerful women across the world might have on American women, disenfranchised women, poor women, young immigrant women? What's the advice for young women who are trapped by society?
Well, we hope that our book can speak to women in every circumstance, whilst it is unashamedly a book about women and leadership, in exploring every obstacle that women have struck on their pathways to power. I think there are things that we talk about in the book that would resonate with every woman's experience. How she was treated as a child, how she formed her expectations about what she would do with her life, how she manages or finds very hard putting together work and family life, how there have been times when she's been dismissed or marginalised, not listened to, not heard. There's not an example in the book of a leader that has come forward who raises both sexism and racism. So, of course, we talk to African leaders, but of African nations. There's not a Kamala Harris or Barack Obama style equivalent, someone who came to leadership who wasn't of the dominant racial group of their society. But given the lifetime experience of my co-author Ngozi and some of the things that Joyce Banda and Ellen Johnson Sirleaf talk about about being received as a Black woman in the world, I hope that there are some things in there that women of colour also find resonate with their experiences.
I think that's all the questions we've got coming in. I have a few more questions. So when I was looking at who did what when in the world in terms of women's elections and leadership, I was kind of amazed about Sri Lanka being one of the first countries to elect a woman prime minister in the 1960, I think it was. And then both India and Pakistan had long-serving prime ministers, Indira Gandhi and Benazir Bhutto, which you pointed out, and I never knew. Theresa May was introduced to her husband at Oxford by Benazir Bhutto. They were classmates. A bit of trivia there, which I found that was fascinating. Anyway, I wouldn't have thought that these were necessarily the most progressive countries, certainly not in their societal norms, yet they allow women leaders. It strikes me as so strange and anomalous. And yet here we are for the very first time in the so-called advanced democracy with our very first vice president who's a woman. So do you have anything that you can add to that? I mean, do you have any even opinions about why that?
Sure. In talking to the women, when we first started thinking through who would we interview, how would we do the book, we knew we definitely wanted to speak to women in different cultures and contexts. We wanted to try and dig into how much impact does culture and context have, and how much is common to women around the world. And, you know, at first glance, you would say to yourself, you know, what on earth can Ellen Johnson Sirleaf, who you know, came from a poor family. Her father died when she was young. Her family was therefore in very dire economic circumstances. During her life, she's been imprisoned, she's been exiled. What on earth can she have in common with Erna Solberg, the Prime Minister of Norway, Norway being one of the wealthiest countries on earth? And of course, so much is different. And yet when you get those two women talking, as we do in the book, there will be shared moments of experience simply because they're women. And so, you know, this analysis of different cultures, contexts and gender takes us into places we may not have expected. And I think it's easy, too easy for us from countries like the US and countries like Australia to assume that our societies are better on these things than countries that we would look at and say are still developing economies. But you know, if just in the team that authored this book, me and my co-author Ngozi, I've told you my story. Ngozi grew up in Nigeria. Both of her parents were academics. Both of them were PhD holders. And I think if people first saw our photographs, they would, if we did a little game with people and said, these are the backgrounds of the women, these are the photographs of the women, match them, put the background with the woman, I think many people would be far more likely to pin the PhD holding parents on me than on Ngozi. You know, Ngozi and I have been doing a variety of engagements and appearances for the book, and Ngozi, as an economist, has been joking, thank goodness the US has finally caught up with Nigeria in having a woman Treasury Secretary, a woman Finance Minister. You've got Janet Yellen. Ngozi was the first female to lead finance the comparable portfolio in Nigeria, and she's been succeeded by 2 other women. So, you know, don't do the snapshot, actually dig into the facts. And a great way of doing that is to look at the World Economic Forum rankings of gender equality. Each year they bring out a very sophisticated analysis of progress in gender equality, and they break it down country by country. And yes, you know, the countries at the top are kind of the countries that you would expect, you know, the Norway, Finland, countries like that. But when you start looking through the batting order, I'd invite you, for example, to look at the comparative rankings of countries like Chile, where Michelle Bachelet is from, and the United States. And I think some things will be revealed when people start looking at those rankings.
Interesting point. Okay, there's a couple of really good comments down here. We've only got about 5 minutes left. The recording of this program should be widely shared with every young woman who we know who wants to learn about successful leadership, in addition to reading the book. So kudos to you. How do you awaken aspirations to leadership in young women? Does it start with the parents?
I think it does start with the parents. And you know, in the chapter I talked about before, You Go Girl, parental influences were very key. But it can't, you know, end with the parents, because kids go out into the world and other influences come into play. So what is being said in school, what is being said in literature, in movies, in films, all of this seeps through into kids' brains. And even when you are trying to role model at home very gender equal conduct, kids can pick these things up. I recount in the book a very humorous conversation I overheard at an airport, where, with the, you know, absolute certainty of a 7 or 8-year-old girl, I saw a girl saying to her mother, "But pink is for girls." And, you know, this very frustrated mother trying to say, "But Daddy's got a pink shirt," you know. So there's no way that that young girl learned pink is for girls in her family home, but she's picked it up somewhere, and she's picked it up quite deeply, because she was arguing the toss with her mother, and she was well on her way to winning the argument, you know, at the ripe old age of 7. So we have to be clear about all of the influences. And the role modelling effect. I mean, if at any time in a girl's growing up, she's looking at the institutions in her society, the person who comes on the TV, who's the Prime Minister or the President, is always a man. The person who comes on to give you the stock exchange report and tell you what's what in the economy is always a man. The person who, at a time of a crisis or civil disturbance, comes on and is always a man in a uniform, a police officer or a military personnel, who tells you, look, you know, in this natural disaster, people now need to do X and Y. Is it surprising that that young girl then gets in her head that, you know, these are things that men do, not things that women do? What's optimistic about that, and I think we've always got to find the optimism, is that this can change. It does change. The experiences of society with more women leaders tells us that it changes. And so the harder we fight for gender equality, the easier it becomes for the next generation. And I do have the sense that the generation of young women coming up now are very knowing about all of this, and they're very impatient. They're looking at us and saying, you know, can you get this done? Like, what have you been doing all these years? We're not going to live in a world of this kind of nonsense. We want it broken down. We want it changed. We want it equal. And we should feel that as a challenge. We should be very responsive to their impatience, because they're right to be impatient.
The Greta Thunbergs of this world. Okay, two very quick things before we have to close things up. You launched the Global Institute for Women's Leadership in London in 2018, which is where you're busy. I believe you work there some of the time. What are the main aims of this organization?
The Global Institute for Women's Leadership was born really out of my reflections about my time as Prime Minister. So I came out of the Office of Prime Minister with this sort of circular set of questions in my head. You know, how much of my experience was about the political circumstances of Australia during the period in which I governed, how much of it was about decisions I and the government I led took, and how much of it was simply because I was a woman. I was trying to unpack that. And I had my first go at doing that when I wrote my autobiography. And I looked outwards at the global research base, because I wanted to, you know, unpack my experiences looking at what was known rather than just reflecting on them as personal experiences. And whilst I found some incredibly high quality research, given how long we've been at the task of gender equality, I thought the research base was far thinner than we would have liked. And hence, the idea was born to have an institute that focuses very directly on leadership and leadership barriers for women. And that's what we do at King's College. And we've got a sister institute that is being established at the Australian National University here in my home country.
That's wonderful. This is a very interesting point that came up in the book. You describe yourself, of course, as a feminist, but your co-author described herself as a womanist, which is a word I think Alice Walker coined. So first of all, what is that? What is the distinction, if there is one? And you said feminism of the head and the heart matter. And you think that you are now better equipped to advocate for women's leadership now you're out of mainstream politics. Well, what did you mean by that? Did you find it limiting, or you got more vision because you've actually can draw from all that experience?
I certainly think I've got a greater field of vision because I can draw from that experience. In my days in politics, you know, I did work on women's leadership. I'm of that generation of Labor women that fought for the affirmative action rule. We were very pressing as a government to make sure that there were ever more women in the positions that mattered. But, you know, when you're in politics, you know, every minute is precious, time is short. You don't have the opportunity to go out, to read the research, to do all of the things that I have more time and space to do now. I don't think I've changed in my analytical, let's get things done approach. I was like that when I was in politics. I'm like that now. Let's get the job of gender equality done. Let's use our voices and use the power we have to do it. I think I've got more luxury in time now to spend more time being swept away by the emotion of feminism, by the joy of seeing women succeed. When I was in the time-poor, pressurised world of politics, if we broke through another barrier, I would be, yeah, tick, we got it done. Let's go and do the next thing. Whereas now I've got the time to just spend more time in the moment and to celebrate the joy of that. As for the difference between being a feminist and a womanist, I don't think in a practical sense that Ngozi and I have different outlooks on the world, but I think we kind of started in different places. I didn't learn anything about feminism until I got to university, and I didn't study feminism. There weren't gender studies courses and stuff like that back then. But there were very active women on campus who were talking about the theories and practices of feminism, and I learned from them. And I sort of came from the structural analysis about patriarchy and how women's roles are confined into being an active feminist. Ngozi came through a journey of being very focused on the strength and the achievements of individual women. Hence this difference in terminology between being a feminist and being a womanist.
Interesting. I like that. That's fun. Okay, I would love to talk a lot longer because this is such a great book. I strongly urge you to get a copy, get your libraries to order a copy if you can't afford to buy one, and then lots of people can read it. I think you've perfectly timed this because of the new Biden administration, which I don't know, do you think it's promising? It looks jolly promising in terms of the setup, the numbers on board, just the sheer numbers in his cabinet and who he's got there looks really to reflect the society we live in, which is kind of
I think
new.
My emotions when President Biden and Vice President Harris were elected, when they did their victory speeches, were absolute joy with a very big dose of relief. So delighted to have seen them come through. Very much enjoyed watching the inauguration and everything that happened. And I know from the people who are involved in it, a great friend of mine, a wonderful woman called Jen Klein, is involved with this administration, specifically on gender equality. And I'm very confident that this is an administration that gets it and will live it, the journey of change that we need to see.
Well, Julia, that was absolutely wonderful. Don't go off for a moment. I know you're dying to because it's probably breakfast time in Adelaide. I want to thank you, Julia Gillard, former Prime Minister of Australia. The new book, Women in Leadership, is out now. I also want to thank Herbert and Dorothy Vetter's generosity, the Lowell Institute, the Massachusetts Cultural Council, and all of you who helped donate, hint, hint. So you can go to the website to do this, www.cambridgeforum.org, where you will find a podcast of this shortly and other forums, as well as details of future programs. In addition, we will make an NPR broadcast of this. We will also have a video uploaded to YouTube, courtesy of GBH Forum Network. Goodbye, and thanks to everyone. Thanks, Julia.
Thank you so much. That was a delightful conversation. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.